So today we are resuscitating the zoom-ins, and not just on any topic, but with the decision of the European Court of Justice that could fundamentally question in various respects the functioning of the international football transfer market. It's known colloquially as the Diarra case. It arises from a preliminary ruling rendered on the 4th October of this year by the ECJ. Upon a series of questions from the Court d'Appel de Mons in Belgium on the FIFA regulations on the status and transfer of players, and in particular its Article 17. The case was filed by Lassana Diarra, who is a professional football player based in France, who was in a contractual dispute with his former club, Lokomotiv Moscow. And Diarra had received an offer by a Belgian club, Royal Charleroi, but subject to guarantees that Diarra would be authorized to play in FIFA, UEFA, and Belgian competitions, and that Royal Charleroi would not be held liable for any amounts due to Lokomotiv Moscow. No such guarantees were provided, so the player apparently missed out on this opportunity, and the player subsequently brought a claim for damages against FIFA and the Belgian Football Association, arguing that he suffered prejudice from the application of the rules of the FIFA regulations on the status and transfer of players, and that some provisions applicable to his situation were contrary to EU law within the context of the internal market. And more precisely, freedom of movement of workers, so that's Article 45 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and competition law, specifically agreements or decisions of association of undertakings restricting competition under Article 101 of the TFEU. Specifically, there were three aspects of the RSTP that were at stake. So first, the principle whereby the new club is wishing to employ a player, that new club can be held jointly liable with the player with respect to any compensation due to the former club if the player terminated the contract without just cause. Then second, the principle whereby the new club is presumed to have induced the player into breaching the contract, and unless the club can prove otherwise, the club is also subject to sporting or financial sanctions, for example, a ban on registering players. And finally, the fact that the international transfer certificate can be withheld by the National Football Association of the former club if there is a dispute between that club and the player, so potentially barring the club in the new national association from fielding the new player. Now, of course, the matter was assessed in the context of a preliminary ruling, though there is no specific determination on the facts of the case. On all three aspects, the court considered that these features of the RSTP were precluded, first under Article 45, so as I said, freedom of movement, subject to it being determined, and I quote from the ruling, that those rules do not go beyond what is necessary for the pursuit of the objective consisting in ensuring the regularity of interclub football competition while maintaining a certain degree of stability in the player rosters of the professional football clubs. But the reasoning of the ruling strongly implying that proportionality would hardly be recognized for the current system. And then second, as well, precluded under Article 101 of the TFEU, and a decision of an association of undertakings implementing a restriction by object of competition, so equally subject to very restrictive exemptions that are available for a restriction by object. So arguably, equally in a way that the system would probably not be able to meet in its current setup. So the issues that we want to discuss today revolve around the aftermath of that ruling. What are the implications of the ruling? What can be derived from the reasoning of the ECJ with respect to what would need to change and what could be an acceptable system from the perspective of EU law? So that's for a short overview of the case. And now, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our panelists today, starting on a first broad topic on what is or could be the impact of the ruling on the current FIFA transfer system and football economy. And I'll first give the mic to Antoine for the legal aspects of that impact.
Thank you, Marjolaine, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be back and to be back with you with a Zoom-in webinar. Thank you to all of you also for joining us. As some of you will know, I already participated in an excellent and comprehensive webinar that was held by Law and Sport 1 week after the judgment. And the idea of having this webinar was also to be less in the hot take moment and be more in a reflexive moment, but also to engage with Stefan Szymanski, with whom I had the pleasure to exchange a bit already on Twitter, X, and soon to be Blue Sky. And to also get into more of an interdisciplinary discussion, to bring in the economics of sports much more into the discussion, which until now has been rather dominated by people like me, the lawyers. So let me first maybe do what I did also a bit in the Law and Sport seminar, but as a kind of basic excursus, the German would say, on what is a transfer from a legal perspective. And I want to start there because it's important to understand that, to understand the impact of the judgment. And first, it's important, and I think most of you will know that the clubs do not own players. We are not in a system where you can have the property over a human being. This is not slavery. Though for many people it feels a bit like slavery, and for many people it feels a bit like you would ask someone in the street, like clubs are owning players. And the question mark and why this case is important is, why do we have this feeling? And this is linked to the whole legal system around transfers, and in particular, the role of the RSTP and of Article 17. Mainly what happens when we have a transfer is a waiver of a right. The former club accepts against an amount of money to waive its right to pursue a case against a player and his or her new club for having breached their for the breach of contract, the unilateral breach of contract of the player. And the question of the value of this waiver is highly dependent on the risks that the players and the new club face if they were to be pursued by the old club. And that is essential to understand why we have a transfer market. The only reason why we have a transfer market is because the club and the new club and the player face a considerable financial and sporting risk if the player decides to break his or her contract unilaterally. And this risk stems only, and that is why the reactions of, let's say, FIFA after the judgment were a bit, how to put it, inaccurate in saying that the transfer system, only Article 17 was challenged. Yes, but Article 17 is the transfer system. There is no transfer system without Article 17. The entire system of the RSTP relies on Article 17. Why? Because it creates risks for the player and for the club in a variety of ways. First, its interpretation by the CAS and the DSC led to a very high valuation of the damage suffered by the old club and the compensation owed by the player in case of a unilateral breach. Second, it imposes sporting sanctions, and this is really important, on players amounting to a work ban in case of a breach. This is something that exists nowhere else in the world, I would say. In a case where you are a worker and because of a unilateral breach of your contract, not only do you have to pay damages, but you are also subjected to a work ban, which in the case of a football career that is relatively short, would amount for us normal people to, let's say, 2 years of a work ban. That's quite a strong risk. And the new club is also presumed jointly liable for the compensation and may as well face disciplinary sanction, in this case, recruitment bans. So here again, this is unknown as far as I know from labor law, in a sense that you would presume a new employer that recruits someone that has breached their contract with their former employer to be liable for whatever damages arise out of this contract and also to face additional sanctions, which are considerable, not being able to recruit new people for 2 transfer windows, which would be like probably a couple of years or 3 years of a normal company. So that's extremely powerful as a sanction and as a risk. And then the fourth dimension is the enforcement of the claim. Is easy because it goes through the disciplinary power of federations. And I think some lawyers amongst you will know how difficult it is to get recognized judgments across borders. Well, this system, the RSTP, is crucial to bypass that difficulty, to allow for an easy recognition of claims and for an easy enforcement, because you can have disciplinary sanctions through the federation, in particular of the clubs. So they face a higher risk again. And then a more minor risk in practice, as far as I know recently, the risk of the ITC being refused, the risk of the recruitment being delayed by the former club through the refusal to provide the ITC. So those 5 elements are constituting a universe of risks that transform players into assets. And that's, from a research perspective, that's kind of super interesting how a private regulatory structure has transformed a player into a tradable asset. And mainly through the Article 17. And that asset could be sold at market price, at least until the contract had run out. And that's why there is a difference with slavery, is that in principle, your contract can run out. And this is basically the arrangement that is fundamentally challenged in the Diarra judgment. And I think irremediably. There is no real way to sugarcoat the judgment. First of all, because the court attacks the mode of calculation of the compensation and deemed it way too both uncertain, disproportionate, and refers back to the importance of taking into account labor law, national labor law. So this is at the same time a source of uncertainty because all national labor laws will have different solutions to deal with a breach of a fixed term contract. And second, the presumption of joint liability of the new club is also deemed disproportionate. And that is key because, in a way, the risks to the new club were much more important in creating a transfer market than the risks to the player. Also because we have the Mathusalem case in the back of the Swiss Federal Tribunal that limits the possibility to issue disciplinary sanctions against players who do not comply with, for example, CAS awards. However, we do not have the same decision for clubs. So it was already quite difficult to, in practice, enforce potentially a CAS award that would allow for damages against a player in national courts throughout the world where they might have assets. But it was still possible to maintain the transfer system mainly because the new club was also at risk and would therefore not take the risk to recruit a player who would have unilaterally breached their contract. So this is why at this point, and there is still a possibility, a very, very, very small possibility that the Belgium court, because we are in a preliminary reference context, the Court of Justice is not deciding the case. It is just providing the, let's say, legal interpretative framework for the national court to decide it. So there is a very small possibility that the Belgium court would say, yeah, I mean, but we believe the RSTP complies with those principles that you have outlined. I would definitely not bet on it. And I think, and this is also what is reflected in the commentaries by many EU lawyers, we have rarely seen the court being so brutal and so clear about the disproportionate nature of a restriction to free movement or competition. So there is very little hope for those that believe that the Belgian court could still find Article 17 to be actually fine under EU law. And if they would, then Article 17 would be almost immediately challenged, either before the European Commission under competition law or before national courts throughout the EU. They would not be bound, obviously, by the interpretation of the Belgian court. So, in short, I would argue that Article 17 is no more, and that should be the basic understanding of the entire football family, and that this will have considerable potential economic consequences for clubs in the near future. The value of players as tradable assets will have dropped immensely. Rich clubs, in particular in the Premier League, will have great incentives to encourage players to breach their contract and to offer them instead high signing bonus instead of paying the transfer fees. So there is a big question mark for me in terms of whether there will still be a transfer market over the winter transfer window. If there is one, it will be held together more by social norms than by legal norms. Because the clubs decide that they will not recruit a player, for example, who has unilaterally breached their contract. That would be a cartel. It would probably be contrary to competition law as well, but that would have to be then litigated. But that's probably the only reason why we will still see a transfer market under the current conditions in the winter transfer window. And here I hand over to Stefan for his take on the impact of the judgment.
Thanks, Antoine, and thanks. That's a very clear and I think illuminating explanation of the framework within which we should understand this judgment. As you say, it's not. I wanted to talk about the impact on the clubs, but I think one has to start with the impact on the players in some sense. And as Antoine pointed out, the players are not slaves. But when you turn a person into an asset, even if that person becomes free when the contract expires, it still represents a kind of a form of indenture. And that is also illegal, at least to my knowledge. Certainly in the UK system, I don't know. And in the US, I am not sure in every other jurisdiction. But the idea that you can turn people into assets is, in some sense, ought to be abhorrent. And I think to all of us in our own lives, we would consider it a gross imposition if we had to live under those conditions. And it's a unique sort of cultural norm, again, that we have made for not obvious reasons an exception to players. That said, I mean, historically, there has long been a sense of unease, and if you go through past literature, you'll find repeated references over many decades to saying this is tantamount to slavery and there is something wrong with it. And indeed, right at the beginning of the transfer system in England in the 1890s, the Football Association actually said this and said this is appalling. We don't want this to happen. And one thing that I think it's worth understanding is the historical basis on which this emerged. Right from the very beginning, the English English clubs, when players turned professionals, the clubs tried to stop players moving by tying them down with contracts which they couldn't breach. And in the 19th century, contract law was interpreted much more aggressively against employees, and people were regularly being forced to hold to the contractual terms. The Football Association found this objectionable and tried to stop it, but they failed. The Football League in England essentially managed to override the wishes of the national governing body. And then it came, and over the following decades, it came to be that the governing bodies just acquiesced and even ended up supporting the system that they originally opposed because of the injustice that it represented towards the players. And so from now on, if what Antoine says is true, and I think it seems to me, I as an economist cannot understand how the transfer system, transfer payments as we have understood them, can really continue. Then this will represent a significant step forward for the players' personal freedoms. And I don't think one should underestimate that. And if anybody doubts this, I invite you to review player autobiographies and read about how their careers are affected by arbitrary decisions imposed on them by clubs saying, oh, now you have to go, or now we want to sell you, or now you can't go because you want to go, and or now your career is over. And all of these kind of arbitrary decisions that get made that aren't made for the rest of us, where the rest of us, when faced with an employer who wants to choose one particular course of action, we have the option to look for alternatives outside. That's something that has been limited for the players. And so I think what we'd see is significant changes for the players. And I would also particularly emphasize the significance of this for players at the bottom end of the system. FIFA says estimates there are about 130,000 professional football players around the world. Of those, only maybe 3,000 or 4,000 enter into the sort of super paid, high paid category that people normally focus on. The vast majority earn relatively small sums of money, and the vast majority of them earn wages that are really quite modest by any standards. And for those players, it's never really been the issue of the transfer fee. That's not really been the issue. The transfer system has tied them down and made them subject to the will of the club. And so, for example, players who might want to leave for personal reasons, maybe because of family reasons, or maybe because, or maybe just because they want a change of scenery, they've been tied down to their club by the system, which has limited the rights that the rest of us enjoy, and that will change for these players. And this has nothing, in my view, this has very little to do with money, but it is a very significant impact. So, turning to the clubs, how is this going to impact on the clubs? Well, the first thing to say is that the net transfer spend is by definition zero, money in, money out. And therefore, in some sense, the system as a whole should be largely unaffected by this. In other words, this is not going to be a situation where there's going to be a huge bonanza for players and wages are going to rise astronomically, because whatever clubs are no longer spending on transfer fees will get redirected into wages, but the money that clubs are no longer receiving in transfer fees will limit their ability to pay. So overall, I would anticipate the net effect would be broadly zero. Now, there is a kind of a short-term impact that one should think about, which comes under the category of, I would suppose, stranded assets. This idea that now these assets that are on the balance sheets of the clubs are essentially worthless. That could cause some accounting difficulties for the clubs. But again, I would argue that these are largely accounting problems and not really having long-term practical consequences for the clubs. Of course, accounting data is often used to secure loans for businesses, and therefore a sudden change in your position of your balance sheet could affect your loan covenants and could cause some financial distress. However, I expect that's unlikely for one reason. Most clubs find it very hard to enter commercial loan markets anyway, because they're such a bad risk. And so there isn't most of the debt that clubs carry is what we call soft loans, so loans from the owners, which really and so that should have very little impact on the overall position. But in any case, the stranded asset positions would unwind over time, and so that doesn't really represent a long-term problem. The one question is that people are going to say is that the players that are free to move, this will cause great problems for the clubs. They will lose their top players instantly, and it will be very hard to run a team. I think that's very unlikely. I think first thing to say is most employees don't want to move. It's not the sort of, we don't live in a world where everybody says, oh, if only I could go down the road and take up another job. You know, we're not constantly shifting. Yes, we change jobs from time to time. There's a natural turnover and opportunities emerge and so forth. But most players will want, like most of us, will want to stay with their employer, and as long as their employer is treating them well. And I think that's one thing that's going to have to change, is that the clubs will have to treat the players better. They will have to look after their highly skilled employees and make sure they're happy. And that's what most companies do. That's what most businesses have to do in relation to their high skilled employees. Football is not alone in being a world where there are high skilled employees, and businesses generally do not have the protection of the transfer system. And therefore they invest a great deal in trying to make sure that those employees are happy and satisfied, and create remuneration structures which are consistent with employee retention. So I think we'll see some changes in the structure of contracts. We'll see some changes in the nature of the way that the clubs interact with the players. But I don't think we'll see a wholesale large-scale increase in turnover of players. I mean, there is already a very large trade in players between the clubs. And as an economist, I suppose I would invoke the famous Coase theorem, which says that it doesn't really matter about who owns the rights to an asset. The asset will always migrate to its best use, to its most profitable use. Where that currently happens when players are traded from one club to another because they're more valuable to the buying club. Now that will happen in terms of an employment contract and a wage offer, but in essence, that should be no different from what we see today. Of course, the big point that people are concerned about are the redistributive issues. And so there is this widespread belief in football that small clubs survive by training players and then trading them to bigger clubs for profits, which then help to sustain the business. And frankly, that is largely, in my view, a myth. It's been held to be true for many, many decades. And when you look for evidence of this, it's really quite hard to find. There's a very good recent article by three of my colleagues, Sam Hoey, Thomas Peters, and Frederic Principe, and they're in their paper. What they do is they try to estimate the distribution of resources amongst football clubs before and after transfer fees. And what they show in their paper is that there's essentially no difference, that the distribution of resources is by and large the same. So in my view, just as in the Bosman case, when that case was delivered, there was widespread hysteria in the football world about this representing the collapse of the system and football failing and clubs going bankrupt and so on. And that just didn't happen. The system survived and adapted in the aftermath of the Bosman judgment. And in my view, that's also going to be true in the case of in the Diarra case, assuming, as Antoine suggests, that it's very hard to see how transfer fee payments can persist in this new environment. I think the clubs will adjust, and football will, to a large extent, continue much as it has done up to now. Antoine, you want to?
Yes, thank you, Stefan. I don't know whether Antoine, you want to react. I see the questions are already piling up in the chat, many related to the different types of impact that the decision could have. I had maybe one, Antoine, if you were going to react, maybe just one a follow-up question also to you that is more legal one. As you said, the Belgian court still has some form of latitude on the case, even if you doubt it, probably correctly, that they would use it to change the spirit of the ruling, let's say. Do you think there is any significance in the fact that the ECJ considered it was a restriction already by object versus effect? So that was my question, if you can incorporate it within your reaction.
Yeah, I mean, then I will tackle that question first, and then I will build on Stefan's final point about redistribution, because I do think that it will play a very big role now in terms of what happens next. On your question, I think it does make a difference that the court was so clear that this is a restriction by object, was also so clear in its in a variety of paragraphs that it felt that this was a system that was benefiting only the employers, and was also very reluctant to actually go into an in-depth analysis of the justification of a potential restriction by object under Article 101.3. Unlike what we saw, for example, in Super League. So I think to a large extent, it's difficult to imagine a judgment where the court is more direct about what it expects the Belgian court to decide. I'm not a total EU lawyer in the sense that I don't follow everything that comes out of the Court of Justice. I see others on the call, like Jans Glinski, who are much more focused on the court, who might, chime in and say this is actually very usual, and it doesn't preclude whatever the Belgian court is going to decide in the end. I do think that is very much precluded. That would be my reading of the judgment at this point, and that it is very unlikely that the Belgian court will be daring to actually decide that the RSTP, in the end, Article 17, is totally compatible with free movement and EU competition law. This is to be decided. We'll see what happens. There might very well be a settlement before the decision, so that we will never know. And then building on Stefan's point, there might also be, whatever I've just said is dependent on there not being an alternative system being put in place. And there might very well be an alternative system being put in place. And I think that's actually the likely destination of the matter. And on this point, that would then put the onus on football players who will want to contest that new system to again go through the entire process of challenging a new RSTP under EU free movement or EU competition law. And this, I think, would raise then really acutely some questions that you have already touched upon, which are what could be the legitimate aims of such a system. Until now, and in front of the court in the Diarra case, FIFA has always argued that this was all about the stability of contracts. It was all about ensuring that basically the teams and that the player respects his or her contract, and that the team roster stays relatively stable. And the reason why they focus on this legitimate aim is because of Bosman. Is because in Bosman, the court decided that the transfer system could not be a reasonable way to attain, let's say, competitive balance and, in a way, redistribution. So the focus has been rather on the stability of contract. And to me, the theory behind this is that harsh sanctions of a breach are disincentivizing players from breaching their contract and incentivizing them from going till the end of their contract. That's a regulatory theory between the idea of having a transfer system as a mechanism that ensures the stability of contracts. The problem is that the transfer system has actually the opposite effect in practice. Because it has created a new source of revenue for football club, and that this source of revenue exists only if the player breaches his or her contract before the end of the contract. What does that mean? Is that actually, paradoxically, the transfer system and any other transfer system will always incentivize clubs to push players to breach their contracts. So to mistreat players, put them aside, tell them they will never play during a season, don't give them access to proper training, to breach their contract, and sometimes more shady stuff, to breach their contract before the end of their contract, because that's the only way in which they can actually cash out of the asset. So in a way, and final point on this is actually celebrated on a yearly basis by FIFA. FIFA gets out a yearly press release announcing we have had that many transfers this year and the market has grown again in transfer fees. So FIFA is actually celebrating an outcome that is the opposite of the one that is supposed to be the aim of the transfer system. And that's why I think the stability of contract is a less adequate aim for the transfer system than even what Stefan is doubting strongly, redistribution. Because I would say on this point, and here I'm curious to see also, this is a real discussion with you, Stefan. I do see, and I think the CIES had a new set of numbers out today, showing how much there might not be, in a way, a redistribution between rich clubs and poor clubs in a league through a transfer system. But there seem to be, and again, happy to hear what you would say, a transnational redistribution, meaning that you have a considerable amount of money that moves from primarily the Premier League, but also the Saudi League, or in the past, the Chinese League, to smaller leagues. Let's say Portugal, Belgium, the Netherlands, where actually the annual income from transfer fees in those leagues, and again, this annual income is concentrated on very few clubs. So think Sporting, Benfica, Ajax, PSV. So this annual income might increase the imbalance inside those leagues, but is greater than the annual income that they derive from broadcasting rights. So here you do have, I think, a kind of transnational redistributive effect. Same thing, there's a lot of money going towards Argentina and Brazil. And this redistributive effect has also potential advantages for some players. Obviously, the richer the clubs are, the leagues are, the more likely they are to earn a higher salary. So isn't there a risk, and this is a question to you, Stefan, that actually fewer players, those that play in the Premier League, for example, concentrate greater revenues, and in a way that the imbalance at the European level between clubs playing, for example, in the Champions League becomes even greater. And there I mean, that would be a hypothesis that I would formulate, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts on it. And I also think if this hypothesis has some chance or is true to some extent, then that is an issue that will need to be tackled in any type of reform that comes after. If we have an alternative to a transfer system, we need to think in a way whether we want to have a transnational redistribution, or how do we manage to limit or to recreate competitive balance at the European level if the economic resources between clubs have grown even more unequal through the disappearance of the transfer system. Back to you.
Thanks, Antoine. So, yeah, so the competitive balance issue is one that has really driven the competition law or the legal defense of the football authorities, again going back to Bosman. And in truth, this is an argument inherited from the Americans, right? So the United States developed what one might call the competitive balance defense, that we have to enter into all these restraints in order to maintain competitive balance within a league. And UEFA latched onto that completely in the Bosman case and has been running with it ever since. FIFA uses it, and the difficulty is that it's so I think there are a number of difficulties with this. So the first difficulty is that it's European football in general and global football in general has always been deeply unbalanced, completely. We've seen perpetual dominance in all of our leagues, really since the get-go. And one of the things that I wrote in a book a few years ago, Money in Football, I tried to point out that if you look across small leagues, big leagues, all over the world, you will find that in almost all cases, a small number of clubs dominate the domestic national league. And that has always been true. And in that sense, there have been limited redistributive benefits of any of the policies that existed in the past. Certainly the transfer system has not really done that. And and indeed, the football authorities have never had any real enthusiasm for addressing this issue in the way that the Americans have. And partly this reflects the nature of the promotion and relegation system in football, which discourages sharing and which creates equality of opportunity for all of the clubs. So any club can make it to the top, but limits the opportunity to create equality of outcomes. Nor is it particularly evident that actually people want equality of outcomes. They want a competitive balance. The evidence of that, and trust me, economists have been trying to find evidence to support this proposition for decades now. The evidence in support of the idea that fans are at all interested in competitive balance is really missing. It's not. There's no real consistent, systematic evidence that that's true. So I think there are a number of problems. Now, what you raise is one very specific form of redistribution, and that's part of the issue here. We have many competitions, and there are many ways you might think of redistribution. You might think of many ways that it might be beneficial, and you propose one, which is rich football countries can redistribute income to poorer football countries through the transfer mechanism, and maybe that's true, has been true to some extent. But I think the problem that I would raise with that is that if let me give the party line economist response to that question, which is this: if you wish to redistribute income, tax the rich and hand income to the poor. That's the way you do it. And don't try to dream up fancy mechanisms which avoid taxation and avoid the reality of taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. I totally applaud the idea of tax and redistribute. It's not. I personally have no objection to this at all, and that would be perfectly sound in football. But let's do that openly and clearly. And to an economist, anything that tries to achieve that end but indirectly is going to be a second best mechanism which creates all sorts of distortions. And indeed, Antoine, you listed in many cases, you listed all of the distortions that this creates in the nature of the incentive in the relation of the contract and the what I would think of as dysfunctional employment relationships that we see in football and have always seen. And in some sense, this ending the transfer fee system is going to create a better employment terrain for both. I think it'll work for both clubs and for players. I think they'll both benefit from the removal of the transfer fee from the system. But if there is a desire, as I say, if there is a desire for redistributive effects, it really should be done through the conventional tax and tax the rich and redistribute to the poor, rather than looking for indirect mechanisms, which are liable, in my view, to be as distortive as the current system, and possibly even more so. Is that should I hand back to you on that one, or do you think that's...
I mean, I don't know, Marjolaine, do you want to enter?
No, I mean, if you want to react afterwards, I think we can start taking questions, because we really have a number of questions. Just maybe before you go ahead, Antoine, we had a comment just to complement this point on restriction by object or effect by Michael Asnar, who was saying it's very difficult to find any justification if it is considered a by object restriction, while if it was considered by effect, redistributive effect could justify the restriction on the routers Mecca Medina. So that was for the more legal point. There were a couple of comments around this, but I'll just let you react. There are a number of comments about how to achieve or whether to achieve redistributive goals. So just go ahead, and then we'll take more specific questions.
I don't want to take away too much time from our Q&A session, so I will not. I will refrain quite to go too deep into the discussion, even though in general I think we agree in the sense that the transfer system is a very bad way to achieve any type of transnational redistribution. Is a way that has it's a system that has so many negative externalities, not only actually on the relationship between players and clubs, but also I mean, we have had the football leagues showing how much it is connected with a number of shady practices, be it corruption, bribery, tax evasion. I mean, I don't think at all that we should regret potentially the disappearance of the system, but I do think that for the system to actually potentially disappear, there is a need to address or to find an alternative to achieve transnational redistribution. And that, I think, will be a bit the policy challenge coming ahead. I like the idea of taxing. The problem would be how to get that taxation going. Where to tax, and how can UEFA or FIFA take money from the Premier League to actually redistribute throughout the world. And that will be, from a policy perspective, extremely difficult, and might be a sore point in the negotiations ahead. Then let me finish by opening the floor for questions, but also by reminding us all that we don't know yet very well what will happen next in terms of the steps to renegotiate a potential transfer system, which seems to be the choice of FIFA through this open public consultation that closed on 15 November, which to my mind doesn't give a lot of legitimacy to whatever outcome will be, in a sense, if it is not collectively bargained, at least with the players. A collective bargaining agreement will have the power of the legitimacy of being co-negotiated at equal level on the same table by the social partners, and might therefore also escape the scope of competition. So there, it might be a way to reintroduce some form of transfer system, a much milder one, through the back door of the collective bargaining agreement. But for now, we don't know, and there is a lot of uncertainty, for clubs and for players for the next transfer window and the one after. There will be an extreme probably anxiety on the market to decide whether to invest a lot of money from the club's part, and for player to decide whether or not they can leave. My argument, if I were to advise a player, is to say, yes, you can. Now your risk is very low. And FIFA cannot block you. New clubs will be interested and so on. But that there is an element of risk and an element of unknown that might preclude some players to make that step, which seems so big, potentially from their perspective. Okay, Marjolaine, you are
Yes,
in
well,
charge of the
yeah,
question.
unfortunately. So I'm going to try and achieve some distribution and redistribution in the questions, not taking them necessarily sequentially, but there was a question, maybe that is a good follow-up to this by Kevin Marston, who also commented, by the way, that this is a case of indentured servitude, which I had I didn't know existed until now, so I looked that up. But he's saying he's curious about the absence of any mention in the decision about the exemption for solidarity or youth training. The words never appear in Diarra, despite being one of the two pillars after Bosman as proportional and justified for restricting the 4 freedoms under Article 45 or 39. So here we are in 101, 102. Is there a case for justification to achieve redistributive goals as if ineffective as Stefan had just argued, or will finally the transfer as a labor regulation tool be uncoupled from redistribution objectives? So I don't know who wants to, maybe Antoine. You
Let me go first with a more legal part, and then I think Stefan will come back on the case to achieve redistribution or not. I mean, this case was not about the solidarity mechanisms or the training compensation. So you have a precedent, the Olivier Bernard case, which recognizes that there can be a legitimate system that actually compensates for the actual training costs. The problem is that the transfer fees are not at all connected to the cost of training a player. So they are not there to compensate training costs and to encourage training. They are there to deal potentially with or to ensure the stability of contract or to achieve redistribution. But the training compensation provision is still there, and I would argue, as it stands, is compatible with at least EU EU free movement law on the basis of the Olivier Bernard case, but probably as well EU competition law as being only a restriction by effect. And obviously the solidarity contribution, which is dependent on the value of the transfer fee, there, that solidarity contribution has shrinked quite radically if the value of the players and the transfer fees are also shrinking or disappearing. So there is again that solidarity dimension, the redistribution beyond the last employer would be gone as well, and might warrant another mechanism to replace it. But again, this would be part of the discussion that needs to be had in the framework of the negotiation to put in place whatever comes after, whether we want to use or whether the football governing bodies want to use the transfer system as a way to redistribute, and whether it is a good way to redistribute. And I think Stefan has already shared a bit of his view on it.
Yes, I let Stefan answer. I just wanted to add a question, maybe Stefan, so that you can also take this into account by Sanders Seldenrijk. What would be wise for clubs outside the top 5 leagues who also make their money by selling homegrown players or talents to the rich clubs? They invest but don't get the return on investment. Does this make the gap between the top 5 leagues and smaller competitions even bigger?
Yeah, I think my intuition is that the answer is no. I don't think it's going to make it bigger. I think one of the, I think smaller clubs have typically seen themselves in two modes. One is, try to get promoted and try and compete with the big guys, or the other is, well, stay small but just develop players and trade them. That second strategy just sustains competitive imbalance. It creates a situation in which clubs have no ambition to get bigger. All they want to do is train up a few players and sell them. And so in that sense, I think getting rid of the transfer fee might actually make the lesser clubs a little bit more ambitious. So, for example, I can see lots of mechanisms by which players who play for top clubs now but can't get a game, for example, will now feel themselves free to try and move to perhaps a smaller club, and those smaller clubs might actually do better. So there are ways in which this could actually improve competitive balance. It could make the lesser clubs more competitive, not less competitive. I also want to sort of say something about the training side of things, because I think I have to say I think it's worth standing back and just taking a pause and thinking about what's really going on. We currently see players at the ages of 7, 8 years old being signed by clubs, and somehow it's absolutely standard for players in their early teens to find their way to the big clubs, which is one reason why transfer fees don't redistribute income that much, because the big clubs, by the time you're 17, they've already got you. And we should ask ourselves whether there is any real danger that there will be not enough training of football players going on in the world. Every kid on the planet wants to play in the Premier League these days. Even in the US, where I live now, there's a whole lot of kids who want to play, want to play for Barcelona or Real Madrid, or it's just, I mean, we have by any rational standard, we have a massive oversupply of talent in football, and the idea that somehow, if it's possible that removing compensation for player training would reduce the amount of training going on in football, that's not the end of the world. And I think we ought to get a sense of perspective on this. So I think overall, clearly, I think to the extent that the transfer fee mechanism has been used as a way to redistribute money to compensate for trading, then if the transfer fee ends, that goes away. And so the authorities would need to look for an alternative mechanism. And as I point out, tax and spend tax and redistribute is a perfectly plausible mechanism for doing that. Subject to finding an agreement, a mechanism of agreement. But again, I just think it's just not the end of the world, and I think people get very overwrought about this training as if it were really a problem, which I don't think it is.
On that subject, there are several questions around players from Africa. So I'll try to take one comment from an ID that I cannot really read, unfortunately, but it says, how does it affect the movement of players from Africa or African? I ask these questions because many players dream of playing their football skills in Europe so that they can make money. And another one, which I think was more a comment than a question, but I'll give you that one at the same time. For Hugo Paris, for many clubs in Africa, Senegal, Mali, Ivory Coast, solidarity contribution is a huge, if not the main part of the club's annual budget, and we already see the negative impact of delayed payments due to the malfunctioning of the FIFA clearinghouse. If eventually transfer fees would disappear, we must find solutions for distributions to those impacted clubs. So those are two questions or remarks that I submit to you.
Antoine, do you want to start?
Go ahead first.
Yeah, I mean, again, frankly, I think the whole transfer fee system has been pretty corrupt for a very long time, and I think that's not really that won't come as a shock to anybody. And so I think, abolishing a corrupt mechanism is probably good for everybody. How this affects the developments in Africa, it will mean that the first thing to remember is the global search for talent doesn't end because there are no transfer fees. The clubs will want to find the best players in order to be as successful as they can, and will want to find the players who cost them the least in order to achieve the greatest success with the lowest possible expense. And so because African players will remain for the foreseeable future relatively inexpensive to acquire, there will still be substantial migration out of Africa. I mean, what we should all hope for is that one day Africa is sufficient, the African nations are sufficiently wealthy that their own leagues don't need to, can survive on their own, on their own revenues based on having a wealthy population that can afford football. We're not there yet, but hopefully that will be something that will emerge in time. But in the meantime, probably the most likely mechanism for the development of African football, in my view, is for good players to move to the big markets in Europe, earn substantial sums of money, and then do what a lot of expatriates do, which is then send the money home and use that to redevelop the sport. And if that means that there aren't, if that mechanism works without with the absence of corrupt transfer deals that we see going on all the time, then that might actually be a good thing for the African leagues.
Yeah, I think I'm maybe a bit more worried about the the transnational redistribution effects than Stefan. I do think that we are in the domain of football, but this is not exclusive to football. There are many other sectors of the economy that have the same issue. We are witnessing what I think another sports economist, a French one, Andreev, was calling a muscle drain. So for a reference to the brain drain. And indeed, there is a question whether let's say, wealthy leagues will compensate somehow the years in which the players have been developed or have been in much less wealthy leagues. And the solidarity mechanisms, with all its defaults, the fact that it was attached to this system that is deeply problematic, was still achieving that. And here I agree with Stefan. In an absolutely perfect world, I would much prefer a taxation system that would then tax the revenue of each, let's say, league around the world at 10%, to be redistributed on the basis of, let's say, the years of trainings of the players in X and Y country for investment purposes in training, for example. That would be an ideal system. Or maybe a different one that Stefan can devise. But the taxation solution would be great on paper. The question is how to achieve it. And if it's not achievable, is it better not to have a system or to have a highly imperfect one? And those are the questions that we are, I think, dealing with right now, that we will have to deal with. There is, in my view, an issue on the redistribution front, on the transnational redistribution front, that is disconnected from the competitive balance question. And that deserves some thoughts. Similarly, I am a bit afraid that economically, certain players playing in certain leagues will lose out in terms of, again, the diminishing revenues of those leagues. So we'll get lower salaries. And usually those are in leagues in which the salaries are already low. And we know that the players that are the more at risks in terms of employment rights, in terms of health and safety and so on, are those that play not necessarily in the big five, in the top leagues, but those that play in more peripheral leagues, where there is less revenue going around, and they are much more badly paid and have much less social security. So I do have concerns about that redistributive dimension, and I think it should be a key issue to deal with in the aftermath. But this is not enough in my mind to justify continuing with the system as it is. So I do think there are alternatives, and that we can develop them. There are ways to develop them. And if FIFA and UEFA would be much more serious about taking a big share of their revenue to redistribute to potentially develop the game in certain areas, to make sure that there is greater solidarity, it can be organized and decoupled from the movement of players. There is no reason why it should be coupled from the movement of players, to the movement of players as it is right now. So I think that's where we probably find common ground with Stefan.
Can I just make a quick point before we carry on, which is just a simple, a basic economics point about supply and demand. So if you think about, if demand is fixed and you increase supply, then what you expect is that the price is going to go down. The wages, if you think about it in the labor market, wages will go down. Increased supply leads to a fall in wages, right? So if you think about the abolition of the transfer system, at any point in time, the supply of talent is fixed or limited because clubs cannot get hold of talent that's available, that's there in the market, because they're tied down to their existing clubs. So in many ways, what's going to happen here is that actually there will be an increase in supply of talent at the top end of the market. All of the players will be available all of the time. And that might actually drive the wages down at the top, not up. So I think, again, that's the thing about this economic mechanism. When you think about it, the things that you want seem sort of intuitive don't necessarily follow through. You can get some very counterintuitive results. So I just wanted to flag that up. We shouldn't assume we know exactly how this is going to pan out in practice.
Stefan, maybe one question that is more again into your orientation before I ask a couple of questions that were more related to the breaches of contract. Alex Gibson was asking, does the panel think that we will see a greater use of buyout clauses set at very large sums, as with Barcelona, for instance, as a means of top clubs preventing their players from leaving?
Well, so the lawyer in this case was Jean-Louis Dupont, right? So he is the same lawyer who was responsible for winning the Bosman case. And if we see large buyout clauses, Jean-Louis is going to jump into action straight away, and we're going to see the same we'll see another case like this. It's not inconceivable that the football authorities might try this, but I think it's just not sustainable because of as Antoine was pointing out, the judgment here was very clear that this essentially, what the clubs were engaged in was creating a no poaching agreement, a way of preventing players from moving between the clubs. And large buyout clauses, which are unrelated to any economic reality or any economic harm that the club might suffer from losing a player, I think are just not going to fly. It's not to say that it might not try. And of course, it takes many years for these things to roll through the courts. So I guess, they might try to buy themselves some time with this. But I think it really is not credible within the scope of this judgment to start applying large buyout clauses, which would mimic the transfer fee system that we've just seen undermined.
I totally agree with Stefan. I don't think that any type of large buyout clauses, first of all, they would be illegal under a number of national labor laws already. So they would already be covered, I think, by the judgment as it stands. But even when they are used, like in Spain, I think their legality is still very shady, even under Spanish law. I mean, they're just being used as a mechanism to set prices for the market and to influence the negotiation in the transfer market in the shadow of Article 17. They don't do anything by themselves, I think. So I do think that this is, I mean, it can be a feel-good kind of mechanism, and again, a way to bridge or to try to delay reconning. And there, Stefan is probably right, that also to impress players who are not well advised, or who do not have proper legal advice. But in practice, I would very strongly doubt that if there were a challenge in court on the basis of again, EU free movement law or EU competition law, depending on who regulates those buyout clauses, that it would stand a chance. So I have, yeah, I don't think that could be a very long-term solution for the football transfer market to survive.
There was a remark by Frank Hendricks under Belgium labor law saying a transfer fee would be completely illegal in Belgian labor law. Unilateral breach of contract is possible. Only damages to be paid rely on pretty normal breach of contract damages under labor law. However, this does apparently not hinder Belgium national football clubs from applying a negotiated higher transfer fee in case of a national transfer. So what makes us sure that negotiated transfer fees would not remain very high at international level? And I'll just add a question, sorry, Antoine, that was directed at you equally on something you said on the breach of contract. Antoine, I would like to ask, why do you claim the breach of the player's contract being the only way to exercise the transfer? In most of the transfers, the situation is quite the opposite. The player's employment contract is terminated by mutual agreement between the player and his former club, which is the condition for the future transfer. Such mutual termination is the expression of freedom of contract, which at the same time is perfectly in line with contractual stability, which the FIFA aims to protect. So I'll leave it with those two for now. Antoine, maybe?
Yeah, on the latter point, I don't claim that breaching a contract is the only way to end a contract. You can mutually agree to come to an end of contract, you can breach a contract, or you can just let the contract run out. The main point is not so much about how you do it, is how much you have to pay to mutually agree to breach a contract. That's the key point. It's not really how you do it. So the mutual agreement is made in the shadow of whatever would happen if you would breach it unilaterally. That the negotiation of a transfer agreement, which is again a mutual agreement, is always made in that shadow. You do not negotiate at a market price because you don't own anything. The only thing that is there is a risk for a player if he or she breaches unilaterally their contract. So if you don't understand that, you don't understand what a transfer is. It is this mutual agreement to lift the risk on the player's shoulder and the new club's shoulder. And this mutual agreement exists to that value only because there is that risk.
Yes,
So
I think that was more clarification for something you said in the beginning about transfers being in connection with breaches of contract, but what you just said clarifies it. So I think it was more clarification request.
Could I make a comment on the economics of this? I mean, it strikes me that this is where, presumably, I would assume this is where the role of agents comes in, is that suppose a player, a club wants to hire a player, and they enter into negotiation with their current club, and they involve the player and say, we're thinking about this move, and then they agree some transfer fee. At that point, I would have thought the player's agent will put their hands up and say, hang on a minute here, my player's available on the market. At which point, from the judgment makes, as I understood it, makes very clear that the player would be, that any club could offer to hire that player without having to pay a transfer fee. And at that point, absent the transfer fee, they can offer to pay a higher wage. So what I struggle to understand is how you could sustain a transfer fee in this system if the players' agents fulfill their normal duties.
Yes, there is a whole discussion in the chat about the impact on players' agent. So maybe Antoine, you also want to react. I'll just read out one comment. The question was, what effect will the judgment have on football agents? Maxence Franceschi commented, player agents are paid based on players' wages. This will continue. Club agents will still be employed to sign players, but their fees will not be a share of the fees, but determined in another fashion. Personally, I believe that agents won't be really impacted if transfer fee disappears, because there will still be transfers, i.e. player movement, and players needing assistance for contract negotiation.
I thought I wanted to address Frank Hendrick's point as well, but which you mentioned earlier. But let's talk about the agents, and let's come back to Frank's point later. Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked about agents, but indeed they will be, I think, affected. First of all, because the value of their services is linked, and here, Stefan, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand it well, in the transaction costs that are linked to the movement of players, or the difficulties of the process of moving from one club to another, in a way, and optimizing that process for the players, for the clubs. If right now it is more of a triangular relationship, but if it becomes just a bilateral one, so just, you breach your contract, you don't need an agent to breach your contract. If it's very clear what you owe to your former club, you just either you pay a compensation that is clearly predefined through a mechanism that is easily calculable. Let's say the remaining wages on your contract, for example, if there is a harm. And then the negotiation is only bilateral between the new club and the player. And there will still be agents equally involved, because there will be a lot of things that will need to be negotiated in terms of contractual agreements. So obviously the profession of agents will not disappear at all because of this judgment. It will just be focused much more on the bilateral contractual relationship. And that might be implying that agents will be in need of working much more in the interest of their client, the player, to actually get well paid. Right now, for many agents, in many situations, there were situations of enormous conflicts of interest, which led agents to actually get paid much more potentially from clubs than from the players, and therefore to favor the interests of the clubs rather than the interest of their players. So that dynamic will change. So in a way, agents will probably be much more accountable to players in terms of what they achieve and how they are getting paid. And that's, I mean, that would be a hypothesis from my side. Stefan, feel free to obviously disagree.
I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think one way to think about it is a lot of people are looking at this and saying, oh, this is going to be terrible, it will be awful for the clubs. Again, one way, if you have agents who are fulfilling what they should be doing, which is acting purely on behalf of their client, then what we will see is more efficient trading going on in the market. So one argument is that, and I think you were raising a similar argument before, is that actually the transfer system is a very inefficient allocation mechanism, and we actually might see a more efficient allocation mechanism of players amongst clubs, and that will actually be to the benefit of everybody, in which case maybe there'll actually be more money for the agents, there'll be more money for the players, and there'll be more money for the clubs. So it actually this whole getting rid of this inefficient mechanism might actually grow the entire pie. I don't want to go, head over heels on this and say that's definitely going to happen. I just think one should consider this rather than think of this as being a disaster. One should think it's actually a possibility of doing things in a way better in the future.
Antoine, I don't know. Yeah, I had something afterwards on collective bargaining, but maybe you just wanted to address the point by Frank Hendricks that you left out before.
Yes, yes, I thought it was an interesting point, and in a way, one that is definitely relevant in practice, in a sense that there is a possibility, to me, rather unlikely, but still a possibility, that the clubs will manage to agree implicitly to continue the transfer system. And that would imply that they would be in a position to coordinate in a way that they would not hire players who decide to go unilaterally. And that they would continue to pay the same market price, that they would act as if the player were an asset. The problem with that proposition is that you have clubs that have very different incentives. So basically, why on earth would a Premier League club agree to do that? They are the ones who have an extremely negative balance sheet on their transfer fees. Why would they continue doing that if they have just a small chance to actually not transfer the entire amount that they right now pay in transfer fee into signing bonuses, for example? I think they will first try to attract players with big signing bonuses, but which are much lower than the transfer fees that they were paying. So in a way, save on the transfer fee, transfer a bit of the transfer fee to the player, but not that much. And in the end, get more profit out of it. So I mean, again, here I have Stefan to correct my basic economics, but I think the point is there will be a lot of clubs with very different incentives, and it's much more difficult to coordinate clubs transnationally than to coordinate them in a small market, let's say Belgium. So I think that will be the challenge if the clubs try to maintain the transfer system de facto, if not de jure.
Yeah, and I'm completely with your economic intuition, Antoine. You sound very well suited to my profession. So actually, I just want to give another example that I think is interesting. So in Major League Baseball in the US, players won limited free agency in the mid-1970s, which meant that after 6 years service in the league, you would become a free agent. And that led to the bidding up of the wages of those free agents quite substantially. And what happened in the 1980s was the clubs actually entered into an agreement amongst themselves not to bid for free agents. So if a free agent became available, it would turn out that there would only be one club bidding for that free agent. This then, of course, this was contrary to antitrust law in the United States, and it went to the courts, and the clubs ended up paying significant damages for their illegal act. And I think that's the thing that the clubs would have to watch out here. If we see transfer fees being paid, I think a lot of us are going to say, what exactly as Antoine says, there's lots of people, lots of clubs with incentive not to pay them. And if they all continue to pay them, then I think we're going to smell a rat.
Sorry, I was reading the chat. Yes, on the issue of the so Arne Ferguson, I'm sorry for butchering up everyone's names. If collective bargaining could be one avenue for a future transfer system, what would be the requirements for a player union to be recognized? I guess it has to be at least a union, including a significant share of the players from all leagues from EU countries. How realistic is it that such a stable EU-wide player union will ever exist?
That's a very good question from Arne, who I know well. And I think he's right to point out, again, this is the solution in the United States, that all of the kind of restraints that the clubs want to enter into the United States are only possible, salary caps, draft systems, so on. These things are only possible because they are negotiated as part of a collective bargaining agreement with the unions, with the player unions, and under US law, collective bargaining agreements are exempt from antitrust. And so that could be, and again, this Antoine will talk on the law. My understanding is that there's some drift towards that kind of situation in Europe. The problem is that the transfer system has to be a global solution, and even within Europe, I don't think FIFPro has signed up every players' union to be part of their organization. My understanding and my guess is that FIFPro is right now engaged with quite intensive negotiations with FIFA about exactly what the outcome will be of this, since we have the transfer window coming up. So I think there will be an attempt. There might be an attempt to do something with this route, but it does seem quite difficult, and it does seem like there would be incentives for some player unions at least to unilaterally deviate from any such agreement.
I mean, I think this is definitely a practical challenge that we will face in terms of ending up with a solution that would be based on a collective bargaining agreement, is that the unions ought to be representative of the employees concerned. I do think that FIFPro could claim at least partial, if not complete, representativity, and that any agreement between FIFA and FIFPro, or and here I'm not sure it's between FIFA and FIFPro, by the way, it's going to be more FIFPro and the club representatives, which are also not united. You have also a division in terms of representation of the clubs, would in any case be first difficult to challenge. So there would be a kind of presumption that this is a type of collective labor agreement, which would make it a strong solution, not necessarily entirely bulletproof, but the onus on the party that will want to challenge it will be heavy. And I think that will be a first way to answer the question, is to say, well, it might not be a proper collective bargaining agreement like we know it in the US or like we know it in national labor law, but it would come close enough to it to be relatively solid in terms of if it faces a challenge, and to discourage challenges, basically. Like we had right now. I mean, the RSTP was nothing. It was just an agreement between the Commission, FIFA, UEFA, and FIFPro around the complaint. It was binding nobody. And in fact, the court has found it to be contrary to competition law, since the beginning, in a way. So there is it's still the symbolic of that agreement, let it hold during 25 years. Let's have that sink in. It was not a collective labor agreement. It had no binding nature at all. So if a soft agreement, and like the one that we have witnessed in 2001, could hold for 23 years, I'm pretty sure that a quasi-collective bargaining agreement between FIFPro and the relevant parties, the clubs, the leagues, potentially UEFA or FIFA, will as well hold at least for 25 years, which would be enough to stabilize the market for that time. So I'm not too worried about the question whether we have perfect representativity or not. I think the message for me from the court is quite clear. If there is not something that looks like a collective bargaining agreement, meaning that representatives of the players have not only a seat at the table, but have equal power in deciding what the outcome is, then we will be extremely tough on whatever system comes after the one that has just been struck down. And I think that's why we will see probably a form of collective bargaining agreement as a solution, as a resolution to the current situation. And this analogous collective bargaining agreement will hold for a while. Not forever. Nothing is set in stone in law, but sufficiently to provide stability for some time.
Thank you both. Did you want to react, Stefan, or? I think it was already going a little bit into the conclusive remarks, so maybe I'll just take there were some final more specific questions about accounting. Maybe I'll just read those out, and then maybe you can both conclude with your own remarks and what you'd like to highlight for to finish. There was a remark on accounting issues, whether it could revive a similar spirit to the Salva Calcio law in Italy in early 2000s, which I didn't know, to harmonize their balance sheets. A question about the impact on stadiums. Could the accounting changes result in increasing the importance of owning your own stadium as a collateral for business ventures? And something that was related, for example, an example about a specific club, sorry for that, Ajax, if I'm not mistaken. Ajax was mentioned, and it appears that they are already making budget cuts because of their current reliance on profits from transfers. Is that wise, too early, or can a period of transition be expected?
Yeah, I mean, on the accounting questions, I mean, I'm not sure that the accounting changes ultimately make that much of a difference. So again, I'm a kind of an economic realist. I mean, it's really the financial position of a club is based on its revenues and expenses, and the assets that the club owns are in some sense representative of the financial position of the clubs, but in many cases, I mean, balance sheets have always been somewhat like fantasy documents in the world of football. So I'm not sure that these changes would necessarily have any direct accounting influence. I think whether the clubs might, I mean, I guess it will always be the case that when you have a significant change in the structure or a significant shift in the balance of power within an economic structure, you will see different parties gambling on different solutions, and Ajax may be gambling on a particular way of adjusting to these changes, and that might not turn out wrong. For example, if Antoine's right and there's scope for a collective bargaining agreement that could preserve the transfer system somehow, then maybe we're all barking up the wrong tree and that nothing much is going to change. I mean, I think that's certainly what FIFA told us to think. So I'm curious. I mean, I find that I'm most curious about is how this collective bargaining agreement might work and what would go into it that would make it attractive for FIFPro to agree.
Antoine, a couple of, I think we've more or less managed to run through the questions. So maybe Antoine, if you want to add some concluding thoughts, and then we'll leave our guest to add his own concluding remarks.
Yes, I mean, I'm curious also about the accounting dimension. I must say here, I'm totally out of my depths, but I'm wondering, indeed, I mean, I'm thinking of a number of clubs, in particular in France, where I'm from, who have been going bankrupt in the past year and who seem to be going bankrupt this year, and who are dependent on potentially selling players to actually not go bankrupt. I think in those situations, there will be an effect in terms of the survival of those clubs. If the viability of your club is entirely dependent on you bringing in a certain amount of transfer fee on a yearly basis, then this is a dramatic judgment for you potentially. Again, assuming that the clubs do not manage to come together to agree to disregard the judgment for now and to continue with a transfer system de facto, which they might do to say, let's do a transition. But still, this wouldn't be a transition because they would still be paying fees and so on. So it would just delay the reckoning. so yeah, I feel it could have consequences in terms of the viability of certain clubs, for sure. If, again, the conclusion is that the transfer system is entirely abolished. On the short term and on the longer term, I think it would be rather a good solution for clubs to build up much more stable and business models who are based on their actual revenues and not on speculation on potential revenues from transfer fees. And now I'm a bit lost in my thoughts because I don't remember what was the other aspect that Stefan touched upon. But overall, I think I know it was the collective. Yeah, I don't think a collective bargaining agreement would save the transfer system as it is. I mean, this is an outlandish proposition for me. I don't think FIFPro would ever sign up to that. What could happen is a soft transfer system, I imagine. So a system by which Article 17 would provide for a clear method of calculation of the compensation, which could be the outstanding salaries. So saying that we will just decide ex ante that the damage is the outstanding salaries at the moment of the breach of contract, which would be a totally different system, much more predictable. So there would not be any negotiation between clubs, and the compensation would be much more limited and proportionate to the salary of the player. So that's probably, if I were to imagine a system that survives after the negotiation, it would look like that. But again, I think this is part of the bargaining process, but we have to understand as well that the unions have potentially things to lose as well from the disappearance of the RSTP on the protection of players in case of overdue payables, for example. So I guess that will be bargained in as well in the discussion. So the terrain is open in terms of what will be the outcome of the negotiations, but I do think it will never be a transfer system, or it should never be in any case, the transfer system like we had until now. And that means also clubs will have to adapt to a new reality in terms of the functioning of this labor market in any case. But now we'll see what will happen in the coming months, and the future will tell.
So, and I'd like to conclude with a couple of observations. So, really, again, taking up Antoine's point about the clubs, the idea of clubs depending on the sale of players in order to balance the books and going bankrupt if they don't. Well, and I guess I'd say two things. I mean, a lot of my research has been about how bankruptcy is kind of everywhere in football, always has been. It's just a part of the game. And the good thing about football is the clubs almost never disappear because they're always bailed out, reestablished, restructured in some way or other, because they're not really businesses. They're more community assets than they are businesses. And that's a good thing. And we don't want them to be franchises. We want them. And so if some rich businessman loses money, oh, too bad. My heart is not breaking. I also want to just sort of emphasize that I really don't think that this reflects the position of the majority of clubs. I cited the research that showed that there really was very limited redistributive effect. So, and I think there's a kind of saliency bias here. It's very noticeable if a club makes money by selling a transfer fee. It's much less noticeable that a club gets into financial trouble by failing to train players in order to generate a transfer fee. That might have been what they were trying to do, but they just failed in the process. And I think there's way more failure because there's a global search. Everybody is searching for the next Messi, and there are obviously very, very few of them. And out of the tens of thousands of football clubs, it's very unlikely that your club is going to be the one to come up with that player. But the sort of final comment I wanted to make was, which is really, and it's something most interesting as Antoine was touching on, is what would the court clearly said that damages could be payable. They should be clear and transparent, but they could be payable. And what they should be seems to me to be a really interesting question. And I think what Antoine was I mean, so the court seemed to hint that actually the outstanding wages payable might be the extent of the damages, which is, from an economics perspective, a slightly odd proposition. Steve Ross, the law professor at Penn State, he's been suggesting that what we should really be thinking about is what are known as expectation damages, which is the amount of money that would leave the club unaffected had the player completed the contract. So really, which is really the difference between what the club was paying the player and what the player was actually worth. The point being that when a player moves, it's more likely that they're worth more than they're being paid than they're worth less than they're being paid. On the other hand, I personally would look more towards what are known as reliance damages. And reliance damages are basically the idea of leaving you unaffected as if you'd never entered into the contract in the first place. And that, almost by definition, is going to be zero, because in expectation, the player's wage should have been equal of their contribution to the club, so the damages should be zero. But I think that is sort of the next interesting battle to come out of this, is what is the precise way in which we should calculate damages. So thankfully, there'll be plenty more work for economists and lawyers. So just for that, I'd like to just say thank you for inviting me to this. It's been very interesting, and it's been great to interact and talk about these issues.
So many thanks both. So there are many uncertainties and unknowns, so there will be also plenty of room for further webinars, I'm sure, and exchanges. But many thanks to both for enlightening us. You have been recorded, so we can always go back and check your thoughts on the impact of the ruling. Apologies for those who maybe didn't get their question picked. I tried to do my best. And especially thank you all for being present and being back in such numbers for this new revival of Zoom In. We'll try to get this into, again, a more regular meeting. So maybe we'll announce something for early next year. But in the meantime, thank you again, Stefan, for being with us tonight. And I'll say good evening and bye to everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.